Good morning. I'm Emily Cruz, the Executive Director of the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to The Future of the Study of Religion, a conference in honor of the publication of the second edition of Critical Terms for Religious Studies. Before I introduce Sarah Hammerschlag, the editor of Critical Terms and the mind behind this conference, and body, and heart, and soul, and whatever the parts of the human are, let me tell you a bit about the Marty Center and give you a bit of info, logistical layout for the conference today. At the Marty Center, we believe the understanding of religion is critical to a functional society. Our programs, projects, and research create a conversation between the expertise of the Divinity School and the field of religious studies and the concerns and questions of a wider public. Today's discussions will touch on many of those concerns, like climate change and the use of artificial intelligence, and their importance for future work in the field. Today's event will be arranged across 5 panels in which authors of the volume's essays will discuss the terms their essays address, then engage in conversation with one another, and then with you, the audience. There will be ample time for Q&A at the end of each panel. If you would like to pose a question, we ask that you queue here behind this microphone so that you can be projected out into the audience. Now that the boring stuff is out of the way, let's do the fun part, which is introduce you to Sarah. Sarah Hammerschlag is the John Nuveen Professor of Religion and Literature, Philosophy of Religions, and History of Judaism in the Divinity School, and the editor of the volume we are here to discuss. She is a scholar in the area of religion and literature. Her research thus far has focused on the position of Judaism in the post-World War II French intellectual scene, a field that puts her at the crossroads of numerous disciplines and scholarly approaches, including philosophy, literary studies, and intellectual history. She is the author of The Figural Jew, Politics and Identity in Post-War French Thought, UChicago Press 2010, and Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Literary Afterlife of Religion, Columbia University Press 2016. She's also the editor of Modern French Jewish Thought, Writings on Religion and Politics, Brandeis University Press 2018. The Figural Jew received an honorable mention for the 2012 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award given by the Association of Jewish Scholars, and was a finalist for the AAR's Best First Book in the History of Religions in 2011. Hammerschlag has written essays on Jacques Derrida, Emmanuel Levinas, and Maurice Blanchot, which have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Jewish Quarterly Review, and Shofar, among many other places. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled Sowers and Sages, The Renaissance of Judaism in Post-War Paris. Her recent book, the most recent one, is Devotion, 3 Inquiries in Religion, Literature, and Political Imagination, co-written with Constance Fury and Amy Hollywood, both of whom are here with us today. In 2025, Hammerschlag was named co-editor of the Brandeis Library of Modern Jewish Thought. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hammerschlag.
First of all, it's just so amazing to see so many of you here today. I think we have something like Emily said yesterday, 200 people actually registered for this conference, which it seems just an amazing sign that despite the situation that we all face right now, we still do care about questions like the future of the study of religion. In fact, it might seem foolhardy to speak about the future of our field when the university as an American institution is under threat. But your presence here confirms to the contrary, the crisis that we face makes endeavors of public thinking all the more crucial. When the university coffers are full and freedom of speech seems well protected, it's tempting to treat humanistic thinking as something of a luxury. But when our peer institutions are sacrificing the core principles of intellectual freedom to the federal government's demands, and our colleagues are facing deportation or worse, merely for voicing their opinions or participating in peaceful protest, then the task of thinking and speaking about questions concerning the nature of power, how we determine the parameters of life, conceptualize catastrophe, identity, and money, just a few of the themes that we'll be discussing today, it becomes not only crucial, but in fact urgent. The case I want to make to you today as a means of opening our conversation is that the study of religion has a pivotal role to play in framing these questions as evidenced by the essays that the scholars gathered here for this conference have written for the second edition of the Critical Terms for Religious Studies. 30 years ago, when the first volume of the Critical Terms for Religious Studies appeared, there was one central issue that pervaded it: the overdetermined role that the Protestant Christian tradition had played in determining the terms of the field. In 2025, as so many of the essays in this volume reflect, essays such as Ali Reza Dustar's on reason, Levi McLaughlin's on catastrophe, Rafe Neis's on life, the field has a new set of tasks before it. Certainly, we're not finished and may never be finished reckoning with the impact of the Christian tradition on our basic concepts of matter and spirit, belief and practice, universalism and particularism. But our capacity to provide alternative genealogies that decenter that influence has blossomed in the intervening years. The study of religion is in a position to set the agenda for the future, because it is built into our very understanding of tradition with a lowercase t to do provincializing work. Our shared field teaches us how languages, literatures, and social practices change and shift with social forces and under varying political conditions. We are trained to see how traditions determine for individual actors how they conceptualize the universal features of human life, such as birth, death, work, sexuality, and gender. It is this facet of our field, its capacity for addressing the cross-section of the universal and the particular, that grounds our approach in this volume. The terms themselves were generated by members of our editorial board, many of whom are here today: Ali Reza Dustar, Benjamin Dunning, Constance Fury, Amy Hollywood, Terrence Johnson, James Robson, and Noah Solomon. The terms were chosen with the aim not of explaining language particular to the field, but to reveal how the concepts and themes of our common parlance are saturated with the history of our religious traditions. As for the future, it's become clear to me in recent months that this project is just the beginning of such work. In the winter, I taught a theories and methods course for our first-year doctoral students, some of which are here today, and asked each of them to develop their own critical term following from their research. The consequences were stunning. Our Bible scholar examined the term coherence, our philosophers technology and emptiness, our historians of religion childhood, sacrifice, and community, our ethicists annoyance and education, our historian of American religions art, and our historian of Islam waste. It reminded me, of course, of all the other possibilities not represented by the volume, but also heightened my anticipation for the writing of these young scholars working in Hebrew, Phoenician, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Tamil. Each one revealed highly specific and distinct narratives and modes of thinking from the cultures they study, and yet the relevance of what they discussed was far-reaching. My own term for the volume was fetish. It is a term we use most often as a verb to suggest that someone inappropriately overvalues something. What I have found most instructive in writing, thinking, and teaching this term is how, when restored to its critical idiom, it can reveal how the study of comparative religions, the role it played in the history of imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Its taxonomy and its terminology then inflected idealist philosophy, Marxist economics, and psychoanalysis. How many of us who use the term fetish or fetishize the verb reflect on its origins as a term used by Portuguese sailors to refer to the amulets of West Africans in 15th century Africa? It was then redeployed via the inhabitants of the Gold Coast to the Dutch merchants and traders of the 17th and 18th centuries to refer to any practice that stymied transparent economic transactions. How many of us recognize its anti-materialist biases? How many of us imagine that it might be redeployed otherwise to undercut the dichotomies of value that still structure our thinking? What emerged for me from investigating this term and thinking with my students about it is the potential to do work in the study of religion that reveals the fraught site of cultural interactions, and to show how such work has the capacity to reshape our futures. It was 7 years ago, I'm embarrassed to say, and quite a few international crises ago, that Kyle Wagner the religion editor of the University of Chicago Press, first asked me whether I'd be interested in editing a second edition of the Critical Terms volume. It goes without saying that a lot has changed in the world since 2018. I think it's like the most consequential 7 years of my life, or God, of so many people's lives. Amidst COVID, some contributors dropped out of the volume and we gained others. We changed some terms, we dropped a few. Along the way, so many people were instrumental in helping bring this project to fruition. Alan Thomas and Kyle Wagner from the press and the incredible production team, the editorial board members and the entry writers. I thank all of you for your patience and hard work. I had 2 research assistants who helped in the process, both of whom I think are here today. First, Livia Bokor, now doing a PhD at Yale, who brought enormous care and insight to early drafts. She not only caught stylistic and factual errors, she also asked great questions and offered suggestions that made each essay that much better. After she left us, Mukti Patel helped get the final manuscript in shape and send it to the press. Mukti's eye for detail, precision, and organizational know-how were crucial to the process. And then there is the extraordinary event today. It could not have happened without the support of Dean Robinson, the vision and dedication of Emily Cruz, the patience, care, and generosity of Tiffany Annette, and the enthusiasm and design acumen of Majid Noli. I'm pretty excited that it's taking place here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Where better to ask about the future of the study of religion? Our illustrious scholars were heavily represented in the first volume, and the essays of J.Z. Smith, David Tracy, and Bruce Lincoln have become true classics. Indeed, the field has been so profoundly shaped by our faculty that you know their names, and I don't even need to list them now. It's a profound legacy, and the truth is that all of us in the field carry on with that legacy behind us and in front of us. This volume and this conference brings together some of the most established voices in religious studies, with a few whose careers are only just beginning. My aspiration today is merely just to facilitate a great conversation. In that spirit, I've not asked our panelists to present papers. Each of them has written an entry that hopefully you will read and teach, I hope. I've asked them today to summarize their essays in 7 to 10 minutes and then to answer a series of questions that helps connect their themes to the work of the other panelists, as well as the scholarship of our panel chairs. Then we will open things up to audience participation. I should also say that we have about half of our entry writers here today, and we're hoping to have a second conference for the next academic year after the volume is out. With all that said, I want to hand things over to our first panelists. So, Rafe and Katheryn, I hope you'll come up. Our first panel is entitled Religion, Defining, Undefining, and Redefining. The questions I've asked the panelists to consider are the following. How much do definitions matter? By what means do we overcome binary thinking? In what ways do the traditions you study reinforce binaries? And in what ways do they disrupt them? Is there something particular to the question of religion that makes it uniquely suited to treat these questions? Okay. Just making sure.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. We're already in conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Our first speaker is Katheryn Lofton. She is the Lex Hixon Professor of Religious Studies and American Studies, Professor of History and Divinity at Yale University, and a series editor for the University of Chicago's Class 200 series on religion. She's a historian of religion focusing on popular culture in the United States. Her scholarship explores the relationship between religion and capitalism in the last 2 centuries. In the volume, she had the honor and the challenge of following up where J.Z. Smith left off. That is to say, her term is religion.
I want to begin by saying that I agreed to write this essay because Sarah was asking. I liked so much that she accepted from the great Kyle Wagner this inheritance, and I felt really held well, as I think we all did, in her wisdom. So I really want to begin by saying thank you to our host and many registers. This really remarkable convening is yours, and I really thank the person you are who assembled us in it. I did indeed write the entry on religion 2 things were important to me as I wrote. First was that I wanted to write something readable by an undergraduate student. When in college here at this university, taking a course in which this was the only assigned book, I understood none of the essays, including, most excruciatingly, my teacher, Jonathan Smith's famous one, in which the class day that he assigned it, we sat in silence for the first 45 minutes. As a student, undergraduate, and graduate, I felt embarrassed and lost in relation to this volume for years. So I knew I wanted to write something an undergraduate could read and understand. Not that it would be interesting to a college student, but that it would be comprehensible by a college student. I wanted to write something they could not tell us that they did not understand. This was a major goal, one that drove all of my decision-making. The other important thing to me was to write something that showed bias, preference, and opinion at the center of religion. I wanted to record how reaction to it, reaction to religion, is what religious studies studies. After writing scores of tenure letters and book reviews within the field of religious studies, I think this is the truth. Religious studies studies reaction. I also thought focusing on reaction might incite the desired undergraduate reader to see their reactivity to religion, whatever it was, as a resource for their participation, to see reaction as an informational basis to join religious studies. I pair with these 2 intentions 2 personal contextual facts. I wrote this essay in a repeated condition of supreme stress and overwork. I also wrote it, I finished it, while preparing an 18-month report on artificial intelligence in my role of Dean of Humanities. A report and a job with which I had, by the point of this completion, a pugilist relation. When I reread this essay last week, what I saw when I read it was loudly these 2 subterranean aspects. I read someone trying to bring order to stress, and someone who was thinking a lot about the patterns of error propounded by artificial intelligence. I offer these contextual facts as a reaction to Sarah's appropriate pressing at the close of her excellent volume's introduction, page 9, if you have your PDF open, as to whether pugilism, a word I use, is the only form scholarly interventions can take. I welcome your thoughts. Can religion exist without a fight? History says no, especially the history of colonial interaction that the last 2 decades of religious studies scholarship resolves as the premise for that category's existence. Even if you're dubious about the overemphasis on political control, I still think reaction, reactivity, is inlaid in the binarism religions organize. So, to serve a hope for accessibility, an assertion of reactivity, the essay I wrote chases through the last 4 centuries of dictionaries, the Anglophone record for the vernacular, and finds system of worship is the definition consistently present. Some dips and alternatives, but system of worship. The essay says that if that definition dissatisfies, invent your own. Most likely you will, since religion elicits people rebutting whenever someone asserts anything about it. Even if system of worship did not, in a documentary way, predominate, I would still prefer it, suggesting again the role of bias. I like how the word system preserves an idea of components somehow connected. I like how the word worship summarizes a differential relationship. The generation of scholarly thinkers that I have spent the most time thinking with do so with regular recourse to words like liberalism, secularism, racism, sexism, capitalism, imperialism. This seems another contextual fact. Complaints about systems, including most powerfully the ones I superintended and protested during the time of writing this essay, surrounded the writing of this. Sarah asked Rafe and me to think about binaries today. Dual pairings are something every pugilist thinks a lot about. Thinking near the volume and violence of AI promoters may be quite pessimistic. Binarism could be refused. Here I mean systems that use 2 digits to represent information. I am interested to think about how 2 things are almost always the way thinking happens. You and me, us and them, 0 and 1. I don't know that binary systems can be refused. They seem, from this very tired boxer's perspective, to be ruling already and will for the foreseeable future. I'm not sure that we can subtract from the study of religion any more than we can from life the reactivity that 0 and 1, us and them, you and me, can make. I'd like to try. I would like to try to rewrite the techno-fascist delight in binary systems as a humanistic opportunity to see the space between 2 things more than the dull delimitation of 2 things. But I don't know that it's right to hope for something against its insistent anthropological real. So I made reaction the subject for religion, since at the very least, it might make this scholarly experience useful for interpreting the drama, the word religion, and the world it occupies. Can't stop superintending. I wanted to write something students could understand, so maybe studying religion could continue, because for me it has been a pursuit of nonviolence, even as it seems always and ever a devastating headline, a cruel tweet, a declaiming that divides. Gen Z seems aching for chill. Here's to hoping the teaching of this volume inspires as much of that as it will also elicit resistance, refusal, critique, disputation. Thank you.
Yes, my turn. Sorry, I'm still thinking. Our second speaker is Rafael Rafe Neis. They teach in the Department of History and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, where they hold the Jean and Samuel Frankel Chair in Rabbinic Literature. Neis is an ancient historian and scholar of Jewish studies, as well as an interdisciplinary artist who works across text, painting, comics, zines, and installation. They are the author of The Sense of Sight in Rabbinic Culture, Jewish Ways of Seeing in Late Antiquity, and When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven. Where's the end of my thing? Sorry, I'm missing my last page. There it is. Rabbis and the Reproduction of Species, Cambridge 2023. Neis's recent art exhibition, Kin, Us and Our Kinds, featured in the Lane Hall Gallery of the Institute of Research on Women and Gender in Ann Arbor in fall 2024. Their term was life. 2 very easy terms, right?
How do you feel if I close this or move it? So, yeah, I just had life. Such a great term. And I very much appreciated the modesty of the term. It's a great term because, on the one hand, it's so obvious, and the need to, actually backing up. The unstated is thank you so much, Sarah. So obvious, hidden in plain sight. Thank you so much for bringing me into this collaborative project, and especially for your infinite patience in my case. I really appreciate it, and everybody who's contributed. So what a delight to be here. So yes, I did appreciate the modesty of the term, partly because of its obviousness and the need to consider it critically being so vital. But its very obviousness, its ubiquity, has actually largely rendered it invisible as an organizing category in ways that perhaps its putative companion, death, is not. You could argue that life has always been a focus of religious studies, particularly in its ethical and qualitative dimensions, the good life, reward and punishment, suffering and pleasure. Also its relationships with temporality, death, afterlife, pre-life, multiple lives, resurrection, underworlds, heaven, ghosts, ancestors, divinities, and other things on that list. We see its links with materiality being studied, death again, decomposition, spirit or soul, to name a few. And of course, it has been much studied via the themes of asceticism, sacrifice, and martyrdom. But the aforegoing topics have not, to my knowledge, been considered under the auspices of life. So just the intellectual project of redescribing all these kinds of scholarship in such a way has great potential, which is not the avenue I took, perhaps regrettably. I have a lot of regrets when I read the piece, actually, which is life, huh? And actually, Life, huh, would have been an amazing title, with a comma, not a colon, just to be clear, that's important. Another avenue is via a constellation of studies that may not see itself as emerging from within religious studies. But as we know, that is precisely the line, the within and without of religious studies, that is the conceit that somehow brings us together. This constellation has emerged in recent decades and interrogates processes of value and devaluation, flourishing and extinction, vitality and torpidity. It tracks how humans have sought to name variation and classify living or non-living entities. Here I refer to work in critical race theory, disability studies, animal studies, feminist science studies, and new materialisms. Much of this scholarship considers life in terms of how apparatuses of the Euro-American colonial and or modern nation states effort to control, propagate, and extinguish life. What is common to this work is a critical regard for how the category of the human, specifically as a life form, is variously constrained to exclude on grounds of species, race, gender, disability, and other normate delineations. And perhaps the spirit of this critical work can be encapsulated in the very notion, for instance, that Black lives matter, for which many exegeses have been given and which explicitly invokes the race, racialization, the material, and vitality to lay a claim against eugenic, or dare I say, genocidal material effects of racism on Black people and others. What might such investigations into life, informed by the above orientations with their critical reappraisal of the human, mean for religious studies? And so in my piece, I largely narrowed my task to be taking ancient Jewish sources as a case study for thinking about life in religious studies via these orientations. And specifically, I wondered about how ancient rabbinic sources, and there is something interesting, I think, going on that we can perhaps discuss in the conference about periodization and religious studies, which I hope we can at some point fight about. No, I won't fight. Yes. Thank you. I always go for the obvious, just to be clear. Specifically, I wondered about how ancient rabbinic sources grant us a locus for considering the classification of lives, the proliferations of life, and the sustainment and flourishing of lives and life chances. And here I'm going to do just a little break in my own writing to just say, to sort of in a way continue on both Sarah and Katheryn's contextualizations, and especially in light of the moment, where I think about how phrases like Black Lives Matter, the power of words and the censorship of words, having a kind of material effect in the world. And I guess it's really interesting for me to be in a time and in a place where I'm defending the academy, about which I feel so deeply ambivalent and from which I felt alienated for at least a decade. And so there's something very ironic that now that words and thought is under a kind of threat of erasure, I'm put in this position of a kind of defense, which is maybe makes me kind of wonder whether it is only religion that has, or religious studies, that has the monopoly on reactivity, rebuttal, and pugilism. And so I just want to sort of note that it's a very interesting moment where the conceit of the kind of secular as the Protestant liberal state is itself being dismantled So, we need a bureau that protects Christianity. We need to protect women and children against biased science. There's a fascinating and radical restructuring of many of the dualisms that are the premise for religious studies. And so this makes my reading of what I wrote I feel a little alienated from what I wrote. And I guess for me, this is the big problem for me, not just in religious studies, but in academic studies. On the one hand, there's a kind of coercive mattering that is not on our own terms and that sometimes forces those of us who have a critique of the liberal academy and its various attendant disciplines, including but not exclusively religious studies. And we're caught up in a conversation that itself is pugilistic to the point of life-threatening. So I think about that, and of course I think about the fact that our colleagues, our students, our friends are in danger of being not just deported, but having their bodies subjected to disappearance in ways that make them not existing in the same ways that we take for granted. And in terms of my own positioning, I think about the attempted erasure of trans people, and including the right of trans people to parent, which is very clearly part of the agenda. So the kind of breaking up of kinship, another kind of enlivening form in which various species like to congregate and assemble. So this, for me, means I need to interrupt the business as usual. I find actually that coherence and argument are failing me, and in some ways, I think, failing. So I would love to think together not just about the future of religious studies, but the future of the future. And to the extent that religious studies is part of that, all the better. Back to my pre-written remarks, which means I need to, of course, type in my password because we must guard the preciousness and the precocity of the words in our computers at all times. And if there is for a minute no activity, no thinking, no alive typing, we must close down the system. This is good. So predictably, in my essay, and this is maybe the regret that I fell into this. I had no choice though. I suggested that despite easy characterizations of so-called Abrahamic Judeo-Christian tradition, and tradition, we can talk about that too. I won't break out my Fiddler on the Roof thing. But tradition with its ideas of continuity, transmission, to me, touches very much on the idea of the life of religious studies as a discipline itself, in as much as it builds chronologies that kind of mimic ideas of life. So I basically argue that despite the kind of common ascription of valorization of life to some invented tradition called Judeo-Christianity, and particularly, of course, certain life forms, that is, the human, guess what? I subvert and rebut that argument. And I say what we actually find in these ancient Jewish sources defies such portrayals. Ha, Donna Haraway. And so you'll see what I mean. This is partly a rebuttal, I can't believe I even had the word there, to the ways that Judaism, whatever that is still invoked both inside and outside religious studies, especially those who focus on antiquity, as the Judeo-Christian. And it's alive and kicking, not just in kind of, right-wing public discourse. For instance, Donna Haraway frames the Judeo-Christian as an ancient offender for erecting binaries, and she's done this throughout her scholarship. And so Judeo-Christianity invents binaries, categories, and dualisms. At the same time, she rescues Christianity by holding up, wait for it, Catholicism, whoa, not Protestantism, because for its non-binary embrace. Think word made flesh, totes non-binary. Obviously, they, them. I say that, and I say that, with great love, because those are my pronouns. The elevation of the human and its life pivots all too precariously on the original idea of the human as a creation in God's image. This idea, whether castigated or valorized, looms large not only in public discourse, but also in scholarship. We find it in right-wing public discourse in the US, but we also find it in liberal and even radical left discourse. Humans are all made in God's image. We are all human, and so on. And then there's actually kind of exegesis by the UCC that actually explicates Black Lives Matter precisely using this logic, founding it in Genesis 1:27, and sort of stating that the need to say Black Lives Matter is that we forget that all lives are in God's image and Black lives are disproportionately targeted. So there's sort of this, that is an example, and you also find it in radical Jewish left-wing kind of anarchist circles who will talk about Tzelem Elohim and Tikkun Olam as the two pillars of Judaism. In the study of ancient Judaism, scholarship tends to assume the salience of human supremacy, whether as reiterations of the crucial or obligatory nature of human reproduction, or as a lesser studied background, this is the dirty laundry, as it were, to the differential valuations by the rabbis of various beings, right, among humans and among non-humans. Without wishing to deny the salience of the human as a major category used to discern life's value, I drew on the multivocality of rabbinic textual productions to highlight significant trends that present alternate frameworks for thinking and valuing life. And of course, death. First, I argued that in their technical writings, the rabbis linked human and animal processes of becoming, what we might call reproduction, and the classification of various life forms. Their linkage tended to deflate as much as promote human exceptionalism. And maybe this is actually a side point. It's interesting how certain writings make it into the history of science. I mean, interesting to the point of being boring and obvious. So Aristotle's History of Animals, Generation of Animals, Galen's writings, Serenus's writings on gynecology, even Pliny's natural histories, which are basically, we stole this stuff, now let's organize knowledge. And that makes it into the history of science. And this is kind of, whereas the rabbinic writings, just merely go into the history of religion. And so we have already in the very formation of what counts as the history of the life sciences, right, only a recent invention, themselves divide, right, ancient sources into traditions. So this is a classificatory problem. True, the rabbis inherited the hierarchically organized creation account and, of course, the creaturely bestiaries of the biblical priestly authors, Genesis 1 and Leviticus 11, otherwise wrongly known as the dietary laws. But in contrast with this often-invoked and idealized scriptural order, the rabbis' writings plunge us into a far messier world. And I believe I have 5 more minutes of my time. Yeah. In this world, biblical schemata, while activated, are always partial. They passed and elaborated Levitical species distinctions, for example, but these rabbis grappled with the unpredictability of life's emergence, the multiplicity of generative modes, even among humans, and the curious resemblance between supposedly distinct life forms, including between humans and non-human kinds. The rabbis weighed in on how the stuff of life, and I'm talking about the rabbis in the first, say, 6-7 centuries of the Common Era, in Roman Palestine, and in Zoroastrian/Persian-ruled Iraq, Babylonia. They weighed in on the stuff of life, and by that I mean the literal stuff of life, from semen to menses to various kinds of flesh and bone and gristle, human and non-human. And the making of life could confound expectations about basic questions like who is kin, who is food, not what is food. That's another pronoun that we don't talk about, the speciesist usage of pronouns, which is about also life and death making, cuts of life and death. And in this, we can sort of look at the work of Mel Chen, for example, who looks at how grammar itself slices and dices life forms. So questions like who is kin, who is food, and what do we owe those we designate as different? The way the rabbis frame these questions might surprise some of us. For instance, they live in a world in which sometimes a human gives birth to a raven or a bovine creature. If he lives, and in their case, yes, it's gendered, because who has more obligations for them? And by the way, this is a bovine or raven-like creature born to Jews. So if he lives, the question becomes what his obligations are and what his family's obligations are to him. Thus, they ask, if our bovine child's brother dies childless, is he obligated to marry his sister-in-law to propagate his brother's lineage, the levirate obligation? Or, the rabbis wonder, can his family say, come, let us slaughter you? And I tell that story or sort of halachic or ritual problem repeatedly because there's something so poignant in the second person address, the kin that is an address to one's kin to participate voluntarily in their own ritual slaughter to be dinner, right? It confounds all the ways that we, again, do or do not expect religions, especially Judeo-Christian religions, to make sort of cuts of life, classifications about life that themselves accord livability or killability on a life form. I'm running out of time. I only have 2 minutes, and I haven't really gotten to the question of the kind of binaries and whatnot. Maybe we can just talk about that amongst us,
Yeah, sure, but we've got plenty of time. We have till 10:30. So
okay, okay. I'll just say a couple more things before I sort of get to some of the meta questions that Sarah asked us to consider, and there I'll just gesture, and hopefully Katheryn and I can then talk. So a lot of what I do is a bit content-y. That is, I showcase surprises from rabbinic literature that serve as certain kind of, I see, maybe problematic rebuttal to expectations. So what is interesting is that one thing the rabbis do not expound upon a lot, and believe you me, they know how to expound. They can take a particle, a conjunction, the vav, which is and generate a whole bunch of stuff. But they do not say a ton of stuff about humans being created in the image of God. So that already is interesting. To the extent that they talk about it, it becomes a technical, the blessing becomes a commandment, which I admit is a massive move, right? That's not a neutral move. But then it's sort of minimally reduced to a plural. And what's the minimum of a plural? Two children. So there's a way that there's a kind of economy, rather than a proliferation, and this is deliberate life-endowed wording, that the rabbis take to the idea of the human. And perhaps it's worth stating that generation for the rabbis is attached to the human because of the sequencing of the biblical verse, which is, basically it follows the idea that human is made in the image of God with a blessing to fructify and proliferate, or some would say reproduce and multiply. I prefer the really literal translation to get at it because it's actually about, the verb is fruiting, which I think is actually a theory of the generation of life that interrupts procreation, which is how many scholars translate that command. So there is a linkage in the Bible between the generation of life and the human. That same instruction, it is often ignored, is given to other non-human creatures. Weirdly, no one expounds on that. I don't hear people saying that. There's a way that even the attention of our own attention to the singularity of the human doesn't actually measure up what's in the Bible. But the rabbis themselves take what the Bible gives them and don't do that much with it in the case of the human and the generation of human life. One kind of general sort of surprise that I add is that to the extent that the idea that human is made in the image of God is valorizing, it actually serves to subvert cherished ideas of same species, two-person heterosexual coupling as the generation of human life. In other words, the rabbis, at least in the 3rd century, and then more and more as you go through successive Talmudic interpretations in Palestine in the 5th century, and in Iraq in the 6th and 7th century, take the idea of God's presence in the role of to endow God a role in reproduction. So, for instance, they understand the biology, if you will, and I'm using these terms deliberately anachronistically as much as religion is an anachronism here. The biology of reproduction, what they say is every human being has 3 progenitors, not 2. There's, of course, a mother and a father, but there's God. And God is a material contributor. So it's a ménage à trois. It's not exactly same species, and it's beyond sex. So, and then in the 5th century, they go on to compare that trihybrid, a technical term invented by science, to another kind of hybrid, which they call the mule. That is, they very clearly sort of enfold human trihybridic reproduction within the realm of what we might call zoology. And actually a kind of zoology that for them is ostensibly forbidden, which is crossing species. They see the production of the human as a kind of species crossing. So that's all cool and queer, we might say. But it doesn't stop there. What that move does, so this is actually the greatest purchase of the human in the image of God, is it actually opens the door for theories of reproduction that in general allow various contributors well beyond, again, dualistic heterosexual ideas of mating, coupling, pregnancy, and then birth. It means, for example, that any kind of coupling can include any third party that can contribute to various outcomes. So it's, we also find some more ancient biblical sources for this. Jacob tries to manipulate the appearance of his father-in-law's sheep by having them mate in front of spotted sticks. We tend to laugh that off as a kind of folk science. But I think the interesting part of it is that the rabbis run with it and understand that life can emerge from one being, from 2 beings, from 3 beings, and life is not always mimetic. So this is a very different theory of reproduction that I think, again, serves as a very interesting comparison to how the Judeo-Christian and even the Jewish is being corralled in public discourse. I think that I'm going to sort of end with that, and maybe we can then chat about the whole binary thing in the remarks to come. Thanks.
Okay, so we have some time. Katheryn, if you want to respond, I think a few themes that I see as orienting our conversation. One is this question of binaries. I mean, Katheryn, you clearly were on the side of like, yes, we're faced with binaries. Maybe there's some possibility of disrupting them, but that's what we're coping with. So, hard to be optimistic beyond that. But Rafe, I feel like your discussion of the rabbinic sources suggests that there are spaces and times and modes of thinking in which we can find our easy return to binaries disrupted even just by the sort of contingencies of life. So that's one. I think the other issue that you brought up early was this question of periodization, and the two of you work in such very different fields, and yet I feel like there are some overlaps in the questions that concern you both. So I wonder how much periodization is, or the differences are an aid to conversation or hindrance. So yeah, let's start with those 2 questions.
I also want to talk about regret.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about regret.
But I will go that, I mean, I just would love to talk about that.
Yeah,
just in general.
Yeah. Which is also, I guess, about a very short periodization, the periodization of the months between writing these essays and the moment we're in now.
Yeah, but I'd just like to, and maybe have, because to me the idea of progeneration from 1, 2, or 3 beings, the person that makes me a religious studies person is all I want to do is talk about that. I want to talk about whatever the sources.
Yeah.
What are sources?
Yes,
Where
right.
are they? I can't read them. You tell me about them.
Sure.
And then I'll know an example that defies Donna Haraway's Catholicity. And I guess I just want to think about how when we occupy our sources, I do, you do, You know, what are we participating
Yeah.
in? And when you arrive at the 1 or 2 or 3, are you kind of delighted? I feel delight when you arrive at that, that it's not incidental or folk wisdom that it's in front of it, but in fact a commentary.
Yeah.
And that you're seizing back on that to say something that's wrong about how maybe the contemporary has been framing what these texts, these ancient sources is for.
Yeah, I mean, and are you sort of, can you say more? Like, because my next move is, and that's a move.
Yes.
And say more about that.
I just am interested in the role of religious studies to be a
Yes.
voice
Yeah.
for how strange these things
Yes.
are that are used dualistically in the world,
Yep.
but in fact are, the deeper you get into them,
Yeah.
surrealistic, strange, animal interested, creaturely
Correct.
interested, defying all of our contemporary vocabulary. And what are we fighting for when we fight for the preservation of some indigenous, non-indigenous tradition known as religious studies? It's, I believe, that claim, that kind of nearness to something that's stranger than this world's kind of cleaning up version of it. And I guess I'd be curious, do you then kind of have a rebuttal to Haraway herself, who I think becomes a kind of complicated, canonized figure of raising up what is right and wrong binary, and that you're actually kind of fighting against the secular that's inlaid in her own voice.
The Catholic secular,
Yes.
though, which is even better. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that's a good characterization of what I'm doing, and I feel chastened by it.
Really?
A little. Because,
Why?
Because
I love that. That's what I converted to. That's religious studies. Or I would welcome and be like, what is that?
Converted.
That's I believe
No.
most people came for that purpose.
yes, yes.
Don't take it away. That's all I have left. No, I really
Oh my
do
God,
think-
this is the same argument I have with so many people.
Yes.
That there is that happening. I worry about the valorization that I'm then doing of the fetish of the sources, the rabbis, the classic. Yeah. Oh my God. You mean? Well, it's because you planted that word.
Sorry, yeah.
The word "the." It's just all over my speech now. No, fetish. And the ways that I'm ambivalent about deploying that cultural capital, right? And so I don't want to deny that there's a lot of shit in the same sources.
Yes.
So, that in the 7th century, for instance, I left this bit out, but as you can imagine, in the 7th century, we're talking, rabbinic Jews living in Iraq. There is what you might call something like a pronatalism that is biopolitical, that is about amassing a corpus of embodying a corpus of Jewish souls that are just waiting to be embodied in order to hasten the coming of the Messiah. And that, it's not, of course, biopolitics in the...
You want to draw a line. I stopped there with them. They are no longer my compatriots. That's what you're naming.
No, on the contrary, I want to say that is also there.
Yes.
I'm not trying to... That's where I worry that I'm valorizing. The rabbis are so cool. And so then my move is, of course, predictably, to go to look at incantation bowls in the same era and in roughly the same communities, largely made by and penned for Jews, largely people who we might call women, in which demons appear, especially Lilith, and that demon appears to thwart reproduction. And the incantations in these bowls are heavily written as divorce formulae. And these are often married women. So of course I'm like, oh, look, these are just the marriages that went wrong.
Yes.
And they were poly. I'm being a little bit reductive here. But you see the move, right?
I do, but
it
I
just
think,
feels very, very cheap.
I guess, but I guess I'm concerned
I'm so
that...
surprised that you're actually, I would have thought...
I know. Well, I've
you would be
been altered by the last 8 years for sure. I've been certainly altered in our
Do you
own
like this
self.
shorthand conversation that we're having?
I think they can
Let me
keep up.
translate this. I would have thought that Katheryn would be all like, please, you're making a move, bitch.
Yes.
I see what you're doing. But
Yes.
instead you're like, no, give me more.
Exactly. Well, I guess I think we've voided ourselves, number one, of pleasure and scholarly exploration
True.
and strangeness.
No,
and that our own representative utility was to be the people who slowed it down and made it. Well, another thing, or it's actually kind of, you can't, the reason that we're not lawyers and we're here is because we're kind of taking a position of I want to be endlessly in the rebuttal, the footnote.
Yes.
And
So
I
you're embracing it.
I am falling into it, not least of which because we are in this form of capital, and I've been doing a history of named chairs and what the role of named chairs has been in the United States study of religion, and we could be really angry at that history, and yet very little exists in the United States, in this particular settler territory, without that incantation of the very anti-Semitic version of the Bible chair. And so I'm pretty pleased that Rafe is in Michigan, not incarnating that form of the
Well, I'm the Jean and Samuel Frankel chair of
Which
rabbinic
exactly-
literature.
exactly.
Completely neutral, the Frankels.
Correct, not. And so
the video. Hi.
And then I do think our own, I feel my own ambivalence about moves has maybe stopped pointing them out as political actions. That I am seeking in a moment of dyadic thinking to say something more creaturely about life. That all of the values enshrined in what I think is a very beautiful essay about that are partly arguments against forms of bureaucratized, hyperbolized, differential thinking. So,
especially when those forms are saying don't exist to so many people.
Correct.
And I think so that there is something to be said of
did we all come to these territories to find our own strangeness somehow?
Yes. No. I mean, I think, so where has what I expect of Katheryn is more of the self-chastening.
Yes, plenty.
Okay, that's happening.
Plenty,
Okay,
but
good.
I believe that
No,
that's the left's general problem right
Yeah,
now. It doesn't
this
quite
is-
know how to get
yeah.
a cul-de-sac of its own
So it's not just the self-location. What you're not looking for is only self-location, doing endless genealogies of the fields.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But can I ask a question? I mean, I hear both sides of this, but one of my questions is the issue around finding these moments. The religious studies offers us these enormous archives of different cultures. And I think it sounds like one of the questions being asked here is like, if you selectively pull from those archives to try to, rebut what seem like the norms of the present, is there something about that sort of move of recovery that we should, on the face of it, automatically be suspicious of? Should we automatically recognize that, in fact, we're not getting the past, we're just mining it for something that we want? And how do we who are so embedded in thinking with tradition deal with the way in which the norms of our present moment are actually determining the things that we choose? And how do we as scholars, given the spectrum that you're describing and the sort of the difficult moment we're in which norms are effacing our very identities, how do we cope with that fact of what we do in the face of that?
I guess one of the loudest things I was struck by in the last 3 years of my witness, and maybe things have been different and where all of you said I'd be welcome, counter-ethnography, is that in the wake of an event that will be for whatever problematic reasons, 10/7, at the 3 institutions I'm most familiar with, not a single scholar of religion was called upon by a provost or president to speak about the crisis that transpired. Indeed, if anything, scholars of religion were pushed down as hard as they possibly could.
I consent.
Because yes, thank you. They were pushed down as far as they could because what they have to offer has no help here in this political reality. For me, that's very interesting. No help at all, none. Eastern Mediterranean. At my university, there's 22 faculty who work in the Eastern Mediterranean, just at the Divinity School of Religious Studies alone. Not one of them was called up for an inquiry about the nature of what transpired.
By whom? By
anyone who was trying to manage a crisis that was entirely about its content, or it wasn't at all about its content. It was about something else entirely. They should have been calling Middle East Studies, American Studies, which one? They're all over now. They're all over now, baby blue. So it's done. We all knew that. The interdisciplines in the 60s knew that. That the commodification of our own organization, see the work of Rod Ferguson, was to the cost of our own ongoing participation in political life. Yeah. So we sequestered ourselves as exhibits and then started hating ourselves for our exhibits. That's what I would say of our possible generation, that there's a kind of self-loathing for being participatory in a system that we see so clearly, our systemization, that we forget altogether the only point was to get people to keep wanting to talk about this weird ass shit together. That was the point, to keep talking about it in different ways than the places and homes and churches and shuls that we grew up in and felt were wrong in their dyadic thinking. And then we came here and felt terrible for all the ways that it was so obviously complicit with criminal imperial authority. And now we're sitting here not speaking to increasingly empty rooms, not empty because they don't think this stuff is cool, but they think thinking it's cool might make them politically and consumer unacceptable in this capitalism. So I just feel our gnawing on ourselves for our mistaken moves has been a thing I have certainly tormented myself with in many constant practices, but has not gotten me excited again. And when I read this, I'm excited about strangeness ignorance.
I'll be honest that I still do it. Yes. And I still take the pleasure.
Yes.
So it's not that my chastening is not actually effective because, and this is where I actually think it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. For me, the project is delving into the strangeness of these sources, holding, I guess, the question, the point that you made about mining, holding myself, trying to hold myself and my ideas lightly.
Totally.
And that means throwing up a bunch of stuff, including shitty stuff, and actually having that all together. So in a way, it's non-binary in that sense. Totally. I'm not looking to write a sermon. Right. And it's okay for me that the rabbis, not okay for me, I acknowledge the rabbis are, say, racist. I don't acknowledge that they're sexist because I'm not persuaded that cisness goes back that far.
Yeah, totally.
So that's a whole thing. And that's another way, but I am persuaded that there's a kind of racialization going on and that rabbis themselves are racialized. It's a mutual, So I guess the voice in my head that is sort of watching myself do these things and see how predictable it is, isn't that loud.
It isn't.
It isn't that
That's
loud,
why I'm
no.
interested in the question of regret, because as I walked through reading and felt also that word, regret. I don't know.
Can you say
I'd be
what?
curious if there's a scholar in the room who's published something and then reads it and says, "Oh, you're so great. You remain as wise as you were in 2018 when you turned this over."
Yeah.
But in general, one's disposition is something like, why did you? So I'm interested in that. Is that a quality? Is that a good thing to affirm? That sort of self-scrutiny as a kind of relentless. Or is that very kind of punctilious self-torture a sort of part of our struggle? I guess I think this volume is quite beautiful. I think it's sort of a remarkable assemblage. So and yet I bet every author in here is a little bit like, please don't ask me about that paragraph. I know. I was just angry that day. What is?
I think it's okay to maybe the language of regret. I mean, it also has this fascinating temporality, poignance, kind of ode to a Grecian urn backwards. It has this sort of feeling backwards feel to it.
Yes.
But I think it's okay to maybe not regret, but to feel the constraints of academic form. I don't think that's a problem.
But I think your point about holding things lightly is so great. And the thing is that this idea of regret, it's tied to this notion that you got it wrong. And if you got it wrong, then it means there was a right, which means that you're reaffirming that binary and the possibility of holding it lightly. And this is why I'm so interested in revalorizing the idea of the fetish, is that that very move is only one that redetermines the effectiveness of that notion of the center. So the idea of holding it lightly and the idea that we get to, mine these resources is that you can also relate to them differently than trying to determine the truth of them. And I think, that's what you suggest when you say holding it lightly, which I think is exactly the right move and exactly the way we can't get out of the binaries, but we can relate to them differently, such that the regret, if we give into regret, then we give into the idea that you could have gotten it right. And you can't get it right. You can do it better maybe, but you can spend more time on it, you can make it more refined, but the idea—
Or get it wrong more interestingly.
Yeah, or get it wrong more interestingly.
I think maybe the other thing that what you're saying is somehow making me think, and this is also kind of thinking about being caught up in the kind of bureaucracies of academia as cultural capital. I'm not that attached to the present. And I'm sure there's many of us who are not fully persuaded, who feel tenuously held by the categories of the present, who feel awry, misprized, adjacent from the past, not temporally askew. And maybe, so in that sense, let's take the example of gender, just a random example that has no purchase on life. because I'm not persuaded, when you're not persuaded fully by the present, it's actually not that difficult to say, I'm going to be agnostic. And I'm going to hold things in a kind of abeyance. I'm going to hold this category, this series of theories loosely as prompts to guide me, not just in the the obvious way. So I don't just, my eyes don't light up necessarily when I see man, woman, virgin. I don't even know how to translate the words from Aramaic or Hebrew into English. I don't just look for the obvious triggers. I look for adjacencies, oddities that speak of structures that may be related, not systems, by the way, not systems. And in a way, what I maybe the mining is a comfort for me, because what I then find is a kind of, attempts to close things and encircle things and organize, right? Organize life worlds. And at the same time, failures run amok and successes abide in ways that would make people with certain commitments about gender today cringe, and I'm glad for that.
Totally.
So there's this, I think that maybe that's sort of, if you're alienated by, if you feel, you still maybe go on to eBay and do buying sprees of vintage sweaters, and you tell yourself it's used, and so it's okay, because it's from the 80s and it'll bring moths to your house, so that's fine. I'm not participating in capitalism at all. What a critique. So there's only so much alienation you can feel, but there's a way when your sense of self, your self-epistemology, your idea of your ontology doesn't quite feel like it's fit. It actually positions you wonderfully. I'm not sure why I'm looking at you when I'm saying that. Maybe because maybe this is actually holding things lightly for certain people isn't so, it doesn't need to, it's not a matter of praise.
Sure.
And maybe it's a matter of existence, actually continuing to exist.
Yeah.
Survival, which is not good enough. Survival is not good enough. And so that's when, and maybe that's kind of gets to the question of the future of religious studies.
How we do more than survive.
Yeah.
With that, I think let's open things up to the audience for questions. We have about 17 minutes, so I imagine there must be questions from the audience. So yeah.
We're going to do a tour.
Exactly.
She's supposed to go to this microphone. I think because it's being filmed, am I right? Where are the people who know?
Hi, Frankel.
Yes.
Oh,
Because it's being filmed, we need to
I haven't even spoken. I do want to talk about decolonizing
so
Jewish
anybody
studies.
have a question?
I did
Yeah.
mention, you understand that when I said genocide.
Yes.
It was just a
Are
casual.
we supposed to introduce ourselves?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Raisa Durandi. I'm an assistant professor here at the Divinity School in Religious Ethics and Islamic Studies. And I had a question for both of you. One of the things that I heard, and that's obviously conditioned by my own interest, but in the exchange, especially about the academy and maybe the interesting comment that was made about leadership not calling on religious studies in times of crisis, is normativity. So one of the things I think that's noticeably kind of skirting around in the volume, there's not a term, is normativity, and the role of normativity and the kind of reassessing that we recently have seen, particularly maybe in other traditions, let's say like Islamic law, where people are more and more grappling with questions of what's the role and maybe even place of a post-Orientalist, kind of more increasingly post-colonial study of Islam for normativity. But I think this applies to the questions about the provost and maybe the rabbis and other things. So I'd be interested to hear from both of you.
And I think that will come up a lot today, the question of where normativity is in study.
About how your thinking maybe has evolved, or what role you see for normativity.
Can you say the last thing again?
How your thinking might have evolved, or what role you see in the future of religious studies, your own work for normativity. And I think I'm particularly thinking about kind of a repositive, maybe appraisal of normativity as something that might make us more attractive, as thinking about rather than historic generations of being very maybe
Neutral.
skirmish around neutral or even afraid, I think, of normativity as we're doing something here that's separate from theology, that's away from the fetters of doctrine, of how we ought to live, to this is what people are doing, right? But have we maybe gone too far? Or I don't, Thank you.
I would love to say something about maybe Jewish studies in this particular moment around this issue. That's really maybe all that needs to be said. So let me say, so the ways that I worry that for a while, Jewish studies will be given a special place in the ways that it is being given under the figure of anti-Semitism. So my concern actually is, and I guess the question, that Middle East studies maybe is abandoned, but Israel studies won't be abandoned. Religious studies may not, provosts may not come knocking at the door, but they do come to the center of Judaic studies. Yes. So I think that is something that the exceptionalism there, the fetish, if you will. That's the right voice for fetish? I think so, yes. Only say fetish in that voice, please. It's a rule of the conference. The figure of the Jew, oh my goodness. Oh, sorry, Sarah. The figure of Sarah, the figure of the Jew, sorry, is being manipulated in a very particular way in public discourse and in the academy. It's directly, it's just, I think one of the problems of analysis is that it's so, you don't even need to analyze. It's just all, the pshat, the plain meaning, it just declares itself. It's kind of amazing. Also, when you read the executive orders, they kind of give their own exegesis. They're so explicit and vitriolic. So my concern then is, how does the Jewish within religious studies, it has a particular ethical obligation placed on it, ironically, and the normativity there is about the a particular kind of academic deployment or a statist demand posed to Jewish studies to fulfill a certain role in the academy and actually in the Middle East and in building a certain vision of American empire, insular as it might be in some ways, right? And so I think that in that dystopian present, people practicing or focusing on Judaism within religious studies have some kind of ethical obligation to speak, to name the ways, I guess there are a bunch of I don't think there's one solution, right? I think resistance and activism can happen in various ways. One possibility is to say, we don't speak unless our colleagues speak. We're not going to be the voice for religion. Don't protect us. Same way that people who identify as women have an obligation to say, don't protect us. Not us without trans people, not us without non-binary people. So I think Jewish studies practitioners have a similar obligation. That's one line. But people will be found who will be happy to speak. And then there's maybe an obligation to give counter speech. And that might be this kind of work.
Yes.
And that means about Zionism too. I should just say the obvious. Yeah.
I just really appreciate that. I appreciate this question. And I think that across my own intellectual biography, the attempt to avoid normativity has been just scurrilous and dangerous and as violent as any other kind of secularism. And definitely here, just in studying with Smith, who had exiled himself because he could not abide being nearby the Protestantism that's so well recorded as a problem in the first edition. And I would just love to see the study of religion think anew in whatever band of collectives we have left about what we do have to think about normativity. I'm interested in that as perhaps a missing essay, because that's for the third edition, to realize that's what we enter into now as there are fewer of us and asking what we're for. So I look for that in the future for what is left. What are we doing together?
Michael Le Chevalier, I'm an alumnus of the Divinity School and work in the para-academic religious space right now. First, Sarah, thank you so much. Just in terms of the forum that you've created for this conference, you've given a lot of breathing room for fun. And that's really been, I think, appreciated. And the levity, I think, is part of making this field attractive. And it's to that I sort of want to pin down on Katheryn, directing the question to you. I really appreciate your comments right at the outset in which you drew a relationship between study, scholarly production, pedagogy, and revivifying, for not a lack of better words, but maybe for all of the caveats that come with it, tradition, or a tradition of the study of religion, a perhaps short tradition in terms of its history in the academy and in this country. And given that the Divinity School has been a space for the formation of future faculty, and that there are both future faculty in this room and advisors of future faculty, can you speak perhaps to us, to them, about the role that scholars have in the reproduction, the handing on of a tradition, of the study of religion?
First of all, just that category of reproduction, I will want Rafe to speak up to as it relates to scholarly inheritances. But this is a question that boggles me regularly, and it goes back to the question of what is the voice when you're reading the essay that hates itself for writing that essay. That voice for me is occupied by several bearded and non-bearded figures who is just yelling. So is that the tradition that I inherit? Is basically the version of rabbinical authority I established with the collective people I served in my own mind to please rebut, footnote, continue the conversation? All I know is that I certainly receive regularly in my pedagogy rebuttal to that from the students that I learn from. That is, there's a real discomfiture, and we see that generationally in a variety of ways. So instead, I want to reiterate what I think you also know, which is faculty is a minority species in our educational program. And I certainly, a lot of struggles within nearby multiple divinity schools and departments of religious studies about that most departments of religious, like departments of comparative literature, are, if they have graduate programs, incredibly boutique ventures with many more graduate students than undergraduates. And so I'm interested in where the undergraduate student sits in our pedagogy and where the students in our divinity schools who are here for a parenthesis of weird, who want to hear from Rafe weird creaturely things about their own identity so they can throw themselves back into some for-profit, nonprofit, I don't care, but they're here for a minute to get their mind to wander, to experience the cosplay of academic work, which I do think is an opportunity to wear a variety of different selves in the present. So I guess I am a little concerned that our participation in the growth and industrialization of the research university has meant that the manufacture of faculty has been perhaps too much of a mesmerizing object, however precious and important I do believe the character faculty might be. And that to the detriment, certainly I would say, the students that are in divinity schools who are not interested in that outcome, but have other purposes, other strangeness, non-responsible, undisciplined uses they might have for these materials. So I have a lot to say about the manufacture of faculty, but I would just say I'm also interested in how that maybe has been something we've spent a lot of time precising, debating, and hierarchizing ourselves relative to that practice. That is, ourselves, research faculty who participate in that work of graduate mentoring. So I'll stop there and I'd love to hear a reproduction.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I at some point would, yes, I fully agree with you about that kind of reorientation, partly, informed by pragmatics of the present, and partly just as an ethical posture, not necessarily interested in reproducing future ancestors. Yes. Future ancestors. I guess I would, at least for me, there's a kind of at least in terms of my own coming into being as faculty, it was not genealogical, it was despite. And so I'm I'm a little wary of that notion of faculty reproduction myself. But also I understand that is speaking from a point of immense privilege. So I want to name that. And also the privilege inherent in imagining oneself as inevitably taken up by that tradition. Yes. That has to be, we have to think about who even is allowed into these haloed paneled halls and who is disproportionately disallowed. before jumping into that question, and that actually puts a huge ethical question mark, or at least some ethical burden on people who do get here and then who do emerge and then do actually snap up the few and vanishing positions. So I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go.
Just like
but,
the word reproduction being offered by you.
Well, reproduction, I mean, yes, I'm anti-natalist.
Anti-natalist.
Yes.
I wanted you to get that.
I'm anti-natalist.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to get.
You understood that I understood that. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for this.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we have time. Yeah, we have time for two more
Okay,
questions.
thanks both so much. Hello, Katie. This comes out of a side you made, Rafe, about the feeling of defending the university all of a sudden after a decade of feeling alienated from it. And I guess I've had a very similar experience. My first feeling of that was like with big law. You know, it's like I feel like I'm no friend to sort of corporate law, but now it's, you know, don't go after Paul Weiss, even though you've been defending Exxon for how many years, and I hated Paul Weiss, but don't, you know, you know, or USAID, it's like, that's a dark history of soft power, and we should be talking about that, but kids are dying of malaria, so how do you talk about the dark history of soft power when kids are dying?
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is, in this, you know, if we think of critique as a kind of dialogue, you know, with an opponent, I think one way to describe what's happening is that our opponent is shifting, like the external opponent is shifting. And I guess I'm struggling then to think about my own positionality in relation to a shifting opponent. What happens to the binary when the binary itself, the lines of the binary move, they seem to shut down other, you know, and, you know, my fear is that critique stops, like, you know, and that it's all, bring back USAID, save Paul Weiss, you know, that's a bad outcome, I think.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, you know, if Katie asked the question of like, you know, is pugilism the only intervention? Is defense the only response or reaction to this kind of shifting binary? Thanks a lot.
That's such a great question. Do I know?
That's Livia.
Livia.
Okay.
Livia, help with the volume.
Okay, right. Okay, I thought so. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah.
You didn't
Firstly,
introduce yourself.
firstly, hi. Nice to meet you. And no, it's not. Yes, your question vibes with how I'm feeling, and I think the answer is not to be singular, is to be plural or multiple. I prefer the multiple to the plural or the pluralist. We can speak in various voices. And so you know, my email signature now, it says, it's U of M, I'm teaching at the University of Michigan. Recently they canceled / abolished DEI, and it has massive implications on the university and its structures. And so one of the things they're going after is what they call, they're trying to align web presences with executive orders and guidance, not just the orders, but guidance. So this is really, really coming towards, right? And so it felt to me a very, very, very small act of resistance in a time where words seem to matter because they're being banned, to add to my signature and all over my websites wherever I can, DEI, 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 you know, don't abolish DEI, resist. Now, you know, I've been critiquing DEI for a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, as additive, insufficient, kind of corporate liberal tick, that also does do stuff, right? And actually in Michigan, it had a serious impact and it really ameliorated the way that the state of Michigan actually doesn't allow affirmative action. And it really seemed to actually push back against that. And so, yes, there's a voice where there is, I think there's room for opposition. Sometimes there's just room for rebuttal, straight up rebuttal. And then there's room for, and this is sort of choose your politics. Are they anarchist? Are they, like, I don't know what they are, but like, I think that there's room for writing that is more complex, that thinks in terms of abolition, right? I mean, I think that, you know, in my heart of hearts, I'm an abolitionist, and that would include the academy. But not the kind of abolition. Now we're facing extinction. That's not the same as abolition. Abolition isn't the end. It's a revolutionary posture, right? It's not accepting that capitalism has to be the last human word. Now, I don't know, you know, that might be completely a ridiculous and unrealistic posture, but I do think it is one potential, a bunch of actions can stem out of that. both narrowly academic, discursive, and beyond. And that's where we get into what you want to call the synagogues, the churches, the malls, those other those churches are also now no longer attended.
Exactly.
But, you know, those other spaces, cafes, Starbucks,
Yes.
right? Other actions that academics can be part of, including academics in religious studies. Now you...
I want to make room for one more question.
Absolutely. I'll
Okay,
toss.
you're going to answer this
Yes.
question.
Sarah Taylor, assistant professor in religion, literature, and visual culture at the Divinity School. Thank you for this amazing panel that I've been furiously taking notes on my phone. One thing that really struck me is there is a kind of debate over the present and the future, and the sort of like citational apparatus of queer theory. Like Heather Love has been cited here, Jose Munoz has been here. And that's not to say that the debate in queer theory is the same debate in religious studies, but you're talking about it, you're citing it. And so I'm wondering what queer theory is doing here for how we think about the study of religion. And it's not just queer theory, it's any kind of debate about futurity. We see this in Indigenous studies and Black studies. And so what are we doing with the kind of playfulness of this theoretical world?
I just love that, Sarah, and I totally agree. I mean, there's no doubt. I've noticed that too in general. I keep thinking it's, you know, whenever a person is in an abject position, queer theory will certainly help you out. And the contemporary university feels, I think, a kind of elaborate abjection. But I want to just, say that I think its presence is complicated because so much of queer theory, as you know, was driven by a really elaborate anguish, secularity that was sort of seeking to divest itself from relations to traditions, holisms, forms of orthodox control. And in general, what is the form of theory that is not, because queer theory was not, however much it could have been, it was not native to religious studies. It was something that came about 2 generations later to the field historically. So I'm interested in the ridiculous. I just want to say again, I got into the study of religion because I found the people I met at the Divinity School very strange. I felt they were the most non-professionalized University of Chicago people I met by far. I felt that they were the least neoliberal of a neoliberal status of personhood by far, compared again. It's a range, it's all within the same form. And I'm very interested in the ridiculous and the odd, the very things that Rafe is raising to me as what is left for us to fight for. I'm thinking about the ridiculous, especially as it relates to a category I love to see across today, how it survives, and that is expertise, nerdiness, knowing a lot about one really specific thing, which to me binds me to people on Reddit threads. It doesn't make me totally in exile from people who are really, really, really just interested in one thing. And how can we continue to practice believing that there is a kind of value in that obsessiveness? And indeed, it's so strange, it's socially awkward to be it, which is why, again, I think these are really interesting buildings to protect.
Thank you. That's a great moment to end on. Thank you both so much.
Great.